Hi, Mona.
Emily, hi.
Hi, how are
Happy
you?
Friday.
Yeah, happy Friday.
Oh my gosh, it's been intense for me.
Oh, so busy with MHA.
I know.
Oh, looks like Katie's here.
Great.
Hi,
Good
Katie.
morning. Good morning. Do we need to record this part or do you want to just do that as a practice? Why don't we not record our conversation?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, let's record after 11. Good morning, everyone. We'll get started here in a minute. I still see people coming in. We have quite a few participants coming on, so we'll start in a minute. Welcome. Good morning, everyone. I think we'll go ahead now and get started. We'll still have some people coming in. I understand we may have something near 200 people attending today, which is just so very exciting. So my name is Katie White, and I'm a faculty member in Health Policy and Management. And welcome to all of you. And also on behalf of Dr. Ruby Wen, who is here with us, who coordinates the seminars for environmental health and environmental or epidemiology and environment and community health. Woo, get this correct. And Dr. Jeff Bender, who is here, program director for the MPH and Public Health Practice Program, who will be introducing our speaker today, representing the Environmental Health Sciences Division. So it's wonderful to have a joint divisional seminar today. So welcome to you all. So what I want to do first, before we get started here and I turn it over to Jeff, is just to do a couple housekeeping items. The first being, if you could please keep your microphone muted during the presentation so we don't have background noise, just remind you of that. But also questions, we'd like to do questions at the end in a Q&A session. And I'm hoping, and our speaker's hoping, we have a really lively discussion and conversation. However, during the session, go ahead and start putting your questions in the chat, and then we'll pull those up first at the very end, and Ruby will help me moderate some of that. And at the very end, we will thank everyone and thank our speaker, and stay tuned because our interim dean will have some words. So now what I'd like to do is to start out with our land acknowledgement. So Emily, if you could change the slide for us. Thanks for that. We want to acknowledge the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and the contemporary lands of the Dakota peoples. In addition, the Greater University is located similarly on lands of the Anishinaabe peoples. We acknowledge that the United States government failed to uphold its treaties with these First Nation peoples, which made possible the founding of this university through the Land Grant College Act of 1862 of the US Congress, known as the Morrill Act. We actively commit to support efforts of this university that aim to redress this injustice. So now I'm pleased and honored to turn this over to Dr. Jeff Bender, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Jeff.
Thanks, Katie. It's a real pleasure to introduce Maria Regan Gonzalez for our seminar. These seminars actually really provide kind of a wonderful opportunity to hear from leaders who are focused on promoting public health. And Maria is just one of those leaders. She is the mayor of Richfield and also systems director for equity initiatives at mHealth Fairview. Her passion and skills are really to serve people. And so I think we'll be hearing about that. She serves really as a shining example of really building the next generation of effective and inclusive leaders. And by the way, she's the first Latina mayor in the state of Minnesota, and also a graduate of our public health practice program here at the University of Minnesota. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Maria. I'm super excited to be with you all today. These are my people. And as Jeff said, Professor Bender said, I am a graduate, a recent grad of the School of Public Health. I was in grad school for 5 years while I was working full-time and in office. And getting my master's in public health in the executive program in public health practice. And I will just say I'm very thankful to the School of Public Health for creating the vehicle of the executive program, because it literally allowed me to keep my day job and not go super in debt, but to work in public health and get my education. So very thankful to be a part of that program. Public health for me is my passion in my life. It's the foundation of everything that I do. I know that that's the case for so many of you here. And I'm super excited to be able to share what I've been learning out in the field and how I've been utilizing and adapting and growing my public health practice and understanding, and in the hopes of giving a different perspective and hopefully catalyzing you to think about how could you change your public health practice to be more effective for advancing racial and health equity through the vehicle of public health. So this talk has been scheduled for months. I was contacted months ago to do this, and I couldn't have imagined that I'd be speaking to you to you about such an important topic a week after a school shooting that we had in Richfield involving 5 young students of color, where 15-year-old Jamari Rice was killed. He was a football player on our varsity team. He had just been on day 2 at his new school in Richfield, transitioning from Richfield High School to the intermediate district. And then the day after that, we had yet another officer-involved shooting in Minneapolis of a young Black man, Amir Locke, who was 22. I didn't know that this was going to be a week after all of that in my community and in our community. And just a couple days ago on Wednesday, we had Jamari's funeral in Richfield. There was hundreds of people there. It was a celebration of his life. And of course, it was devastating for the whole community. And before that funeral, I had to leave an event earlier that day, which was a celebration of life, a birthday party for Jonathan O'Shaughnessy, who was a Richfield resident who would have been turning 29, but had his life taken away by gun violence in 2017 after being a victim of a drive-by shooting in Richfield, after he was leaving. Our largest event in the community of Richfield is our 4th of July Red, White, and Blue Days. It's a whole week of beautiful celebration. People are literally dancing in the streets, beautiful fireworks, and he was walking home with his mom from the street dance and was just blocks from his house, and a van pulled up and he was gunned down. And today in 2022, we're still looking for his killers. So imagine the difficulty that Jonathan's family goes through. So I just want to say that that's the context that I'm holding today. I feel a little bit beside myself. And I think, the sense of collective grief has been weighing very heavy on me and my heart. And I know that it has on all of you as well. And so what I'm trying to do is honor that grief and not disassociate it, but also not succumb to that feeling of complete helplessness. And that's why we are here today. And actually, what this does in these events have only given me more drive, more passion, and more fire to be doing the work that I'm doing in public health and prevention, in advancing racial and health equity, because these are the strategies that we need to stop our children from killing one another, to stop the gun violence, and to stop the killing of our communities. It is by applying our public health practice in ways that are inclusive, that are equitable, and that build power in our community. And so in many ways, even though it's a hard time to be giving this talk, it also is exactly the perfect time to be giving the talk as well. And I'm very excited to be sharing what I've been learning in the field. So I've had the chance to watch a few of the seminars. They're awesome seminars. You guys have great people coming in, sharing their research, sharing their learnings. And I think that mine is going to be probably a little bit different. I am not so focused in the public health field on the what of public health field, but how we execute our public health practice. And I'm out in community 24/7, testing it out and working and ideating and refining and improving. And so I'm really going to talk about the how we execute our work in public health. And this isn't just for public health professionals, it's anybody who wants to do meaningful, impactful work in their community. These principles apply to anyone doing that work. So I'm going to go to my slide deck here, share my screen. Oops, 1 second. Okay. Let's see. Can you all see my screen? Yes, okay, and it looks like it's loading. So again, how do we utilize public health to catalyze action for transformation in our communities? So these are the things that I want to make sure that are key takeaways from today's discussion. One, it is blatantly clear that we need to be doing things differently, not just in the public health field, but across our community. We have widening inequities between people of color and other communities that have been disenfranchised for generations, between the haves and the have-nots. The systems that we have built are not working for anybody, and we need to change that. And we have the tools in public health to make that happen. So what I want to talk about is how do we combine public health with different disciplines to blend them together in practice to be more effective and to ensure that we are actually achieving the equity impacts that we want to see in our community. So I'll be talking about frameworks. Then I'm going to share a personal story that we've been living in Richfield, where you can see these things applied in the outcomes. And that's going to give you tangible examples. So as you're hearing the story, think about all the different roles, the stakeholders, the positions. Public health professionals could be in any part of that those stakeholder groups. So we are needed everywhere. So how do we blend public health frameworks in the background in the discipline that we have in our education in the public health field with community organizing, another discipline that I have a background in that is exceptional in helping us identify concrete tools to carry out these public health frameworks effectively and to be able to make large-scale systemic change at different levels in our community. And then how do we make sure that we're also taking methodologies and approaches rooted in racial equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion to make sure that that is the foundation of our work so that we are actually building the power and the leadership of our communities and the people most impacted, and that we're not perpetuating inequities in the name of equity. And then the last component that I have found is very important that I don't hear many people talking about is that there's a component of doing that internal work with yourself, getting to know who you are as a person, what your drivers are, what your history has been, what your identity is, and how do you carry that out in your day-to-day life? Because what I've seen is when people don't understand who they are and what drives them, this is where we get good intentions with unintended negative consequences, again, perpetuating inequity in the name of equity. And then I'm going to share some examples of what this all looks like in practice. Let's see. Okay, so before I dive into the different tools and methodologies, I want to read a poem of a teacher that I love so much that has guided my leadership, Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Zen Buddhist teacher who has informed my leadership and who recently passed away. He talks about the same concepts that I'm going to talk about today, but he articulates it so beautifully in this poem that I love. It's called Heart Like a River. If you pour a handful of salt into a cup of water, the water becomes undrinkable. But if you pour the salt into a river, people can continue to draw from the water to cook, to wash, and to drink. The river is immense, and it has the capacity to receive, embrace, and transform. When our hearts are small, our understanding and our compassion are limited, and we suffer. We can't accept or tolerate others and their shortcomings, and we demand that they change. But when our hearts expand, these same things don't make us suffer anymore. We have a lot of understanding and compassion and can embrace others. We accept others as they are, and then they have the chance to transform. So the big question is, how do we help our hearts grow? And to me, it's just a beautiful articulation about what we need to focus more on. The work that we're doing is complex, it's multi-level, there's so many pieces to this work. And if we focus on a narrow piece of that work, we're going to miss the effective transformational component in change. And I think it's about being able to grow our practice so that it can hold the immensity of the complexity of the issues that we face with compassion. It's about being able to hold those spaces of tension, being able to engage with people different than ourselves, understand their perspective, and come up with solutions that are rooted in community. So I just love this poem, and I think it's a way that we can understand our work differently. So a brief introduction. I am a bicultural, biracial Midwestern Latina. My father and his family grew up with great-grandparents being Irish and Swedish immigrants that followed the log trade into Minnesota. They landed in Mora, Minnesota. They started their dairy family, or their dairy farm. And that's the background of my father's family, dairy farm family in Mora, Minnesota. All my family's here. Grew up here in the Midwest playing ice hockey, going to Mille Lacs Lake, get to the cabin, eating hot dish, all of those great things. And I also have a mother who's a Mexican immigrant from Ciudad Nezahualcóyotl in Mexico. And half of my family's in Mexico and has a very different life experience. And I grew up in both of these cultures and can hold both of those realities. And I just own that, because actually I think that the reason I do the work that I do as a bridge is because I've always had to be a bridge, being very bicultural, biracial. It's a space where I feel very comfortable. And so it's kind of what I call home. You guys already heard my professional background. I'm the mayor of Richfield. I also am the newly hired Systems Director for Equity Initiatives at Fairview. And I'm really excited about that position because it is the 4th largest employer in the state of Minnesota, and it's the largest health system. So I get to work with an amazing team of people to envision what does it look like to build the infrastructure within the healthcare system to embed equity in everything we do, and how do we model that? And we have a great new racial restorative justice coordinator that started this week, and his accountability is to bring restorative justice into the system as well. So really exciting opportunities at Fairview. And I also help lead our family business, which is a data analytics and data science company that is minority owned, Latino led and run and operated. And we work with food processors, food manufacturers, food systems folks looking to transform the food system and use science and data science and analytics to do that work, so that we continue to build out a robust, accessible food system. So I know that sounds like a lot of stuff, but it's all the same thing. It's transforming large, clunky mainstream institutions to be more equitable and inclusive, and it's my passion. And then you can see pictures here of a lot of amazing Latina women. I'm also the co-founder of a Latino childcare provider network that was started in Richfield called La Red Latina de Educación Temprana. And we are a coalition of aunties, grandmas, sisters, family members that are watching kids but are not formally trained. And we believe that this family, friend, and neighbor childcare system needs to be better supported to help grow healthy, school-ready kids. And so we started 8 or 9 years ago with 13 of us, and we have trained over 350 community members in quality childcare for free in a way that's culturally appropriate. So that's another big part of my identity. So I'm going to start with the area that a lot of us are probably most comfortable with, which is public health frameworks. So like I said, public health frameworks are really the foundation of the work that I do out in community. I use public health as the foundation when I'm thinking about the types of interventions that we need to advance to create this large scale systemic change for improvements in our community. This spectrum of prevention that is a part of public health is something that I love to go back to when I'm thinking of any issue that we're working on in the community, whether it is gun violence, whether it's diabetes, whether it's affordable housing. I'm thinking of all of these different layers, from working one-on-one with individuals and changing behavior change, all the way to ordinance changes, public policy, legislation, and everything in between, organizational practices, education, fostering coalitions. So this is a great framework. Anything you're doing, think about, are we working at all these different layers? Now, it doesn't mean one person can't do this alone. It doesn't mean you need to be working on this, but if we really want to do health equity work in our communities that's effective, we have to be working at all these different levels. So who do you know and who are you working with, working at all these levels? So this is a great check for you when you're looking at what you're trying to impact. It helps us give a framework that really is not just about creating a Band-Aid fix, but really focusing on impacts that are going to change and be around for generations to come. That's the other thing I love about public health frameworks. It's really a generational framework that we use. And then the point that I'm going to make later is that these are great frameworks to use in our work to build out the foundation, but we can't assume that just applying public health frameworks alone without the equity focus, without the organizing focus, is going to advance equity. We need to bake these other things into our approach. And then lastly, as someone that works quite a bit on public policy issues, I'm a public policy maker myself, I have been able to use public health language and approaches to help depoliticize issues that honestly, they shouldn't be politicized, but they are politicized. We've seen our COVID response and mitigations being politicized. We've seen affordable housing be politicized. We've seen education be politicized. And yes, they're public policy issues that need political and policy change, but they shouldn't be polarized in this way that we see in our communities. And sometimes using the language and the framework of public health in our communications can help bring it back to, hey, these aren't political issues, conservative versus liberal, Republican versus Democrat. These are issues that we all face. And actually, I would say the frameworks that have been used at the state level here in Minnesota around affordable housing have really been rooted in these approaches in their communication. And we've been able to get bipartisan support statewide for affordable housing because of using this type of language. So think about public health language as a way to depoliticize hot button issues. Another framework that I use every single day in my work, and is actually the reason that I ran for office, is the concept within public health of social determinants of health. So as a public health professional, I know that 80% of what impacts individual health and community health are our behaviors, our physical environment, race, socioeconomic factors. These are the social determinants of health. And so in all of these areas are the areas that we all need to be working in. So once you start to think about our practice in that way, we should be everywhere working with a public health framework affecting this 80% and the 20% within healthcare. So actually, that's why I decided to run for local government, not knowing what the heck, where to start, because I wasn't very involved in that. But I said, hey, if 80% are these things, who dictates and who controls and who determines this 80%? Our local governments, our school districts, our Hennepin, our county commissioners, our city councils. And this is why I decided to run. So I did not come from a political background, political interest. It was the public health nerd in me that was like, whoa, local government oversees social determinants. So So now I want to spend a little more time thinking about some frameworks that, we might be a little less familiar with that I think are very important to be pairing with our public health work in community. The first area is community organizing. This is a discipline where you can do a lot of research. There's plenty of books on community organizing. There's even training institutions and classes you can take out there. I would say take those, but I would just encourage you to go out in community and build your muscles that way as well. So community organizing is really focused on empowering and building strategies rooted in the people most impacted to design and carry out solutions for their health and their well-being. So this is just, I'm not going to go into each area, but big picture, it's rooted in relationships. So relationship building is central to effective community organizing. Power building is central to community organizing. And this is something that I think we don't talk about enough, that we might even have negative feelings around, is power. Power is bad. Community organizing has taught me that power is neither good or bad. Power is the ability to make change, period. Our ability to make change. So when you think about the work that we want to do to improve health at the population level, we want to build power. We want to have the ability to make change in our own communities. So how are we doing that in the work that we're carrying out in our projects? How are we identifying and building our constituency base, the people that are most impacted, and supporting them to get the tools to grow their power to create their own solutions for community health and well-being? So this is a big picture framework of community organizing. You can do some research on your own and learn more about it. Oh, okay. The next part of community organizing that I want to talk about are concrete tools that community organizing offers us in our work that when we apply it in public health can really help us. So in organizing, there's a concept called one-on-ones. So that's literally meeting one-on-one with a person, face-to-face, in person, in the community, with the sole interest of getting to know them, their story, and what they care about. In public health, and not just in public health, but in a lot of other disciplines, we schedule meetings as a first opportunity to meet with someone. We already have our agenda, we have funding, we have an idea scoped out, we know what we want to do, and we just need to find someone to do it. This is a very dangerous approach to take. This is where we get into the territory of, if that's where we're going to start, this is going to get us closer to perpetuating inequities in the name of equity. So we need to start with getting to know the community through one-on-ones, and just no other purpose than getting to know who we're working with, who's in our community, and what they care about. Through one-on-ones, these are vehicles to identify the self-interest of those in our community, whether it's at the individual level or at an organizational level, which then will give us the tools and capacity to speak to the self-interest of those individuals in those groups with the intervention or the project that we're working on. How is what we're doing relevant to the community that we're partnering with? Again, sometimes we don't do that, and we say, this is why you need to do it, and the studies show this, and you need to do this. And we come at it from a place of expertise. Yes, we may be experts or have the skill set in public health interventions, but we're not experts in the lives and the experiences of the community. And we need to understand what they care about, and we need to help advance the things that they care about. I talked about this already, but the whole concept and the tool of building, expanding, and sharing power, that needs to be foundational to our work. Not one person, not one organization, not one intervention can really do this large scale, systemic, multi-generational change that we need to accomplish to improve health in our community. So in order to make this effective change, we need to be able to work with others to build, expand, and to share power along the way. And actually, community-based participatory research is a great example within public health that focuses on this building, expanding, and sharing power. So how can we think about community-based participatory research? but apply that in practice out in community. We may be doing research, but we may be working on interventions that might not entail research. It's the same concepts of community-based participatory research, but out in practice. There's some great tools in organizing called power mapping and stakeholder mapping. Again, we don't take power into account and how power is influencing the issues that we want to change. And when we're not aware of these dynamics, especially if we're people in organizations that have power, we are exercising our power and we create these power imbalances, again, leading to perpetuating inequities in the name of equity. So how can we map out in the ecosystem of whatever the issue is that we're trying to impact? What are the different levels of ability to make change, power, that different individuals and organizations have, and how are we influencing them? Who are they going to listen to? What's going to motivate them to make the change that we need to make? So you can literally map that out with somebody. This is something that I think we do very well in public health, changing narratives, but we might not think about it this way. We think of our, public health service announcements and all the education we've done over the years to stop smoking, to help curb, drinking, things like that. And so in public health, I think we are able to change the narrative, but mapping out what is the dominant narrative on any issue and what is that dominant narrative allowing us to do. And let's see, I'm trying to think. So one of the examples that I'm thinking of here in public health, there's so many, is I think there was some narratives years past where, obesity and chronic disease, the dominant narrative was really on the individual and the individual choices that you're making. And essentially it's your fault if you're experiencing chronic disease or you're overweight or obese, without recognizing the role that systems and environment played. So public health has done an exceptional job, especially here in Minnesota, with things like the statewide health improvement program that put out a different perspective and narrative and say, hey, it's about building communities where we can be healthy and thrive in, and changing the environments to support health of an individual and in a community. So again, thinking about that component in our work, what is the common narrative out there? And what are some counter narratives that are more equitable, more inclusive, that bring more people along? Another concept in organizing that's great for us to use is engaging in the inside-outside organizing. So what does that mean? When we think of outside organizing, we think of community-led activist groups, we think of marching in the streets, we think of putting pressure on politicians, we think about base building out in community, kind of maybe what people might think of activism work, advocacy, things like that. Community groups putting pressure and organizing for systemic change from the outside. What we don't recognize, and actually I would say probably in the organizing space, we don't recognize that in order to be effective with those strategies, we need agents of change inside the mainstream institutions. That's the inside organizing. That's where I live and work. In the ecosystem of social change. And that's where I think a lot of public health professionals oftentimes live. They live in the, state departments of health. They live in public health organizations. They live in academia. We are oftentimes as public health professionals placed within large mainstream institutions that are the power holders, that are the organizations that need to change to be more equitable. So an effective strategy has to have both pressure and accountability being demanded and pushed on from the outside, paired with people and catalysts for change within those organizations. Otherwise, you keep pushing up against institutions and they don't change because that locus of power stays within that organization and there's no in to make the change. And what I will say too is if we don't do both the inside organizing and the outside organizing, again, opportunity to perpetuate inequities. So using La Red Latina as an example, we have built a completely alternative system to early childhood support education for our childcare providers here in Minnesota. Why? Because the state mandated kind of supports and resources and the definition of quality childcare really leaves a lot of our communities out, our cultural practices that are also quality, but quality has been defined in a way that's leaving our communities out. The funding and training, support, and resources are mostly for licensed childcare providers. The majority of our childcare providers are not licensed. They're aunties, their grandmas, their family members. And we know that to be true. We're all childcare providers. After the pandemic, what kind of supports are there in the state? Little to no supports for informal childcare providers. So we've created our own system that helps with certification, to helps improve quality in using evidence-based practices, but making it accessible. That is the outside piece. We have created an alternative community-based system that is accessible to our community. And we're also working to change the public policy. We're working with the Department of Health. We're working with DHS. We're working with our public policy makers to make sure that the state is putting funding for family, friend, and neighbor childcare providers. If you only do the outside work and you don't do the systemic change work, you're actually getting yourself out of the way and getting the communities out of the way and allowing the system to keep operating the way that it's operating inequitably. And if we only focus on the inside work and not do the community change work, I don't know if we'll ever see the systems completely change 100% to be more equitable. You have to do both. So again, organizing principles to think about being more effective with our public policy or our public health work. The last piece, I don't think I have to explain too much, but we need to ensure that the people most impacted by these issues are the ones leading and driving the solutions. I know that that makes some of us very nervous. What if we can't give the community what they need, what they're looking for? We have to be more comfortable in supporting community to design and implement their own solutions. Our job is to provide frameworks, supports, resources, connections to make that happen. Another concept that we don't think about traditionally in our public health work is our work is leadership. How are we carrying public health practice as leadership? And are we perpetuating kind of a traditional form of leadership that is very much focused on centralizing power, authority, decision-making? One way that I see that we still do this today is we often look to the community and we do listening sessions, focus groups, we get input from community. Then we, the experts, go back, design the interventions and carry it out in community and dictate and decide how the funding is going to happen, how those interventions roll out. And the only role that the community has is us going to them again, harvesting their wisdom and knowledge, often unpaid, and then us deciding what to do with that, and then telling people how we're going to roll out the intervention. That's done in all different fields, but this is kind of a red flag of where we need to think about our work differently and how we lead. Versus collaborative leadership. How are we using our work and our interventions, again, to build the power of the collective, of the communities most impacted? How are we saying, hey, let's do things like rotating, taking meeting notes and facilitating and coming up with ideas and finding every single way you can in the work that you're doing to build the capacities, the skill sets and knowledge of community. And it's not just one way. Community has so much to show us and teach us as well. So how are we learning collectively? How are we moving this work forward? And how are we ensuring that the community also has power and agency to decide how the funding is spent, how the interventions are created? And if we don't have that funding or that's outside of our scope, that's okay. We're public health professionals. We have broad networks and we can say, hey, you know, we might not be able to do that, but let's work on finding somebody that can fill that gap and that can still be part of our intervention that becomes more comprehensive. It just might not be something that we are doing within our within the scope of our department. The second to last bucket of concepts that I want to talk about pairing with our public health practice is racial equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks. We don't think about where we are as individuals, where our organizations are at, and where our communities are at in their ability to work across difference, in their ability to communicate messages effectively with people who are different from themselves, with different cultural groups, with different people who have different identities, urban versus suburban versus rural. And if we don't think about these things and take these things into account, again, and I'm just going to keep saying this, am I perpetuating inequities in the name of equity, or am I really working towards advancing equity here? And the more we can be aware of these things, the less of a chance, and the more we bake these things in, the less of a chance there is to perpetuate these inequities. So an intervention that is focused on diabetes in South Minneapolis is going to be very different in approach than an intervention that we might do in Wilmer, Minnesota. We need to understand where our communities are at. And there's actual frameworks. Again, there's disciplines and things you can do to learn online about racial equity frameworks, diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks. But this is going to help you be effective speaking to the self-interest of the people you're working with, making sure that your communication is appropriate, that it's effective, that you're bringing people along. And then it also helps you understand, where's this group at, where am I at, and what's my growing edge, or what's their growing edge, and how are we building opportunities to expand that growing edge so that we can grow in our understanding and build our skill sets to work across difference. This is another framework, racial equity framework. There's things like the continuum of being an anti-racist, multicultural institution, a framework that we could be applying, that we should be applying in all of our interventions across our organizations, understanding these concepts and figuring out how to embed them into the work that you're doing. And then lastly, the piece that I think we need to start with is, do you really know yourself? Really? And I know that this might be difficult to understand, but we need to do the work of getting to know who we are as a person. What does our power and privilege and identities look like? And how does that show up in the way we communicate, in our education, and what we have access to, and how we interact with others, how we use our power and privilege, how we work across difference. I will say, I see this a lot in Minnesota, where people might have great intentions for wanting to advance equity, justice, more inclusive community, but because they aren't aware of their own power and their privilege and who they are in the world that they're operating from, again, they support interventions or they take approaches. I think call out culture and all the, Facebook activism and all that kind of stuff sometimes can be fueled by wanting to do the right thing, but really taking the wrong approach, especially when you're in a space of privilege. And again, not really supporting solutions that are going to be effective, lasting, community-led. So we need to operate from a place of knowing where we are. And I think if we could focus on this more and understand how to embed this in our work, we wouldn't be the state in the country that has the worst racial inequities in the nation, not just in health outcomes, but in a lot of different indicators. We have been leaders in public health and community interventions here in Minnesota for years, but we don't do so hot when it comes to doing that same level of work for our communities of color. And we need to ask ourselves why. We need to understand where we are operating from as individuals. So I'm going to show examples of what I just talked about with sharing the story of Richfield. I had a lot of examples. Let's see, I'm looking how much time I have. Okay. I had a lot of other examples, but I wanted to keep it cohesive. This is my beautiful, amazing community of Richfield. Who is Richfield? So just for folks who don't know about Richfield, we are a first-ring suburb. We're completely landlocked. We're small in size, 7 square miles. We are bordered by South Minneapolis, the airport, Bloomington, and Edina. This Rambler here, you've seen that house. You've seen all the houses in Richfield, or at least a large majority of the houses. We were fully built out in the 60s, so we have a lot of 1950s, 60s era buildings still in the city of Richfield. And so any development in our city is redevelopment. These statistics in terms of numbers are actually from the 2010 census, so they're old. I haven't had the time to update them yet, but we've been about $15,000 or $10,000 below the average median income of the Twin Cities. And you see who's surrounding us: Edina, Bloomington, South Minneapolis. So we have a different socioeconomic mix of residents than our neighbors. Actually, today we're closer in tracking to 50% people of color and 50% white residents. We have a large foreign-born population where we've seen a lot of growth in the past several years. Today, 71% of the students in the Richfield School District are students of color. And from the research we've done with our health equity data analysis that we did a few years ago with the Public Health Department, we found that we might have the largest racial inequity in home ownership rates in the state of Minnesota. And there's a long history, and I could talk about racial covenants and all of these things, what happened before World War II and after, and why we have this statistic in Richfield. But we have about almost 80% of our white residents in Richfield are homeowners versus 29% of our residents of color being homeowners in Richfield. A huge inequity and disparity. So I'm going to share our story kind of in chronological order to highlight some of the concepts that I was talking about. So I already told the story of La Red Latina. We started with 13 of us, mostly women, undocumented, low-income women living in apartments, primarily Seasons Park, which is an apartment off of 494 in Portland Avenue. We've grown to be over 350 people strong, and they've done public policy change. In the bottom left here, we are with folks from Bloomington Public Health, with our representatives, with folks from Blue Cross Blue Shield, where they achieved getting $1 million in funding for family-friendly neighbors, I think 2 years ago now, which is a drop in the bucket. But to have zero support, financial support for FFNs, to this group advocating for systems and policy change and making that first step in getting money and recognition at the state level was huge. They've been crucial in providing healthy food access to our communities during COVID. You can see in the top right corner, that's something that they responded to, and also working to make sure that our community had accessible vaccination opportunities. So you can start to see that when you focus on community organizing, you can see all the different things that they're working on addressing and advancing. They're working on healthy food access, which is clearly a public health issue. They're working on vaccinations. They're working on public policy change and resources. But we've been able to do this work because we've focused on building the power and the support and agency of the community most impacted, not us coming in and saying, here's what you got to do. So it pays off in dividends to be doing our public health work in that way. And then in 2015, this is before I was in office, we had the largest mass displacement of affordable housing in the state of Minnesota that happened in Richfield. There's actually a documentary on TPT called Sold Out, where there was a very under the radar sale of an affordable housing complex to a market rate developer who essentially flipped it, put some paint on it, didn't do too much outside of that, kicked everybody out. 40% of the residents were Latino, 25% of the residents were African American. We had over 700 affordable units. We had 145 students in our Richfield School District impacted. Once they were displaced, it was an immediate loss of $1.5 million and layoffs of 33 staff in the Richfield School District from the displacement of one affordable housing unit. We had families and students that were left homeless. Not to mention the tremendous impact on our community that we still haven't recuperated from. There was no support. People were literally left out in the streets, and the tenants organized to file a lawsuit. And that was at the time the largest fair housing lawsuit that was ever won in the nation's history. And they put some pretty amazing legal precedent saying you cannot evict, even if it's informal eviction, because it was non-renewal. So technically it was an eviction, but really it was, because people could not come back. They were not allowed to renew their leases. And you cannot renew, or you cannot displace mass numbers of protected classes. So that precedent was set. There was precedent on screening requirements. They said, well, you can't have kids, you have to have this credit score, you need this income. They said no, the ruling said no, you can't have those types of screenings, because essentially you are, again, screening out protected classes of people. And then there was protections put in place for tenants. So that happened in 2015. That was a huge impetus to do things differently in Minnesota and in Richfield. And in many ways, it was the alarm bell in the Midwest. This had been happening for years in Seattle and out west, the gentrification and loss of affordable housing at such a quick pace. But it really hadn't happened a lot in the Midwest, and Crossroads was a big alarm for all of us. Then you had the national context of what was happening. So many continued officer involved shootings, so much gun violence. In 2014, we had the killing of Michael Brown. And throughout those years, myself, community organizations in Minnesota and nationally were fighting to get undocumented Minnesotans healthcare coverage in Minnesota, and with the Affordable Care Act. This was before the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act passed and left undocumented community members out. So really impacting negatively the health and the well-being of our community. And then the last thing, not the last thing, but the last thing that was the impetus for me to run for office was that Philando Castile was killed, shot and killed. And that was the moment and the day that I said, I'm going to run for office. There is an all-out war on people of color in this country and in this state. And it is subliminal in the lack of granting of healthcare as a basic right if you're undocumented, to all-out blatant in our officer-involved shootings and the violence that we were seeing in community. Philando Castile was killed in the summer of 2016. And in the summer of 2016, I decided to run. I do not recommend to anyone to run for office and make the decision when filing closes. That was very stressful. We didn't know what we were doing. I had never knocked on a door for a candidate. I had never been a part of the campaign, and all the people I knew were in the same situation. Many of the people, had not voted and participated in elections, even though they were eligible, because as you know, our political campaigns and candidates really don't, they really leave our communities out. So we were able to accomplish what we thought was going to be impossible. There was a person that was endorsed by every politician locally and was kind of the next anointed, appointed person in line by the party to run for the city council seat. And we won with over 60% of the vote when nobody supposedly knew us. Nobody thought we had a chance. That is the power of mobilizing your community. We did not take the party path to organize. We organized the aunties in the churches. We organized the youth groups. We organized the apartments, the people that we knew in community that were being left out. And that is why we won our election. And then 3 years into being a city council member, I had no clue what I was doing. I was drinking from the fire hydrant. 3 months into that, we got a tip from the superintendent, who I still don't know how he heard this. He said, hey, I heard that Seasons Park is at risk for being flipped, just like Crossroads at Penn. Can you verify it? Do you know anything? And I went out to my networks that I had through community organizing with affordable housing advocates. And I said, hey, could you help me figure this out? And they said, yep, we can verify that this is the case, but there's no purchase agreement in place. So there's a little window of opportunity here. And so what we did, from 10 days from hearing that this could be a possibility, 10 days later, we were able to secure a blind counter offer by Aon, which is an affordable housing nonprofit. And they called they called Seasons Park and they said, listen, we heard that there's a sale. We know there's no purchase agreement. We are putting in a blind offer. We're going to focus on keeping people in their homes. And we were able to give a second mortgage through our Housing and Redevelopment Authority. We passed after that 20 different tools of ordinances and public policy at the city level to protect our housing. And that, again, another example, this is a public health issue. And how did you mobilize community through that organizing concept? But then how did we make sure that it was those most impacted? The tenants were calling, the tenants were on the radio, they were on the news saying, we have an opportunity to make a change here and keep people in their homes and keep housing stability for our students and our families of color. Look at the difference between what happened at Crossroads at Penn and when you apply these frameworks. This is Seasons Park. We've invested over $15 million now in Seasons Park to date to improve the conditions and qualities of the housing there for our families and to make sure that we're not hiking the rents for our families. Then in 2018, I had the chance to run for mayor. Look at this beautiful picture that we have here. When do you see community members of color, immigrants, babies, youth, all kinds of leaders taking power and control of a city council dais in joy, in celebration, and saying, we won as a community, we are here, we won our election. This becomes about changing the face of power and leadership and bringing it back to the communities. Very exciting time for all of us. And since then, and in between those years that I've been in office and we've been working in this way, we've done things like implement body cameras, police reforms. We dismantled our Civil Service Commission. We're the only department in the state tracking excessive use of force of our officers. We started a sustainability commission with a climate action plan that is rooted in racial and health equity. We did what all local governments do, which made me feel so much like Parks and Rec. We organized our trash and we did so successfully. We have organics collection as well. We passed prevailing wage ordinances, wage theft policies, human trafficking ordinances. We built out and hired staff to build out our citywide equity infrastructure. We're looking at updating our Wood Lake Nature Center, which is the only wildland in the urban core of the Twin Cities, located in Richfield, 150 acres, and we're reconstructing it in partnership with communities. We are the only wildland center in Minnesota that attracts the most people of color, the most youth, because you can literally take a bus from Lucy Laney School in North Minneapolis to Wood Lake Nature Center and access nature and free programming. The schools have been able to close the 4-year graduation racial inequities at Richfield Public Schools. We've impacted the work of the reconstruction of 494 and 35W, and I'll talk about that later. And we've been able to implement a COVID response that has been rooted in community, where the Department of Health and Blue Cross located mobile vaccination buses at Seasons Park, at our apartment complexes. We mobilized community groups to be going door to door to work on our COVID response. So I'm wrapping up here. I have one more example and then we're going to go to questions. This is a part of the Richfield story. It's a little disjointed from the story that I had shared previously, but actually a lot of the same actors are involved. So currently we are engaging in one of the largest, it's going to be the largest reconstruction projects, which is the reconstruction of 494 and 35W, right where Best Buy is, the Mall of America, the airport. That is the most heavily trafficked piece of road in the state of Minnesota. Every single day, there's people from all over the state that use it. And if you see the little star here at the bottom, do you see that star? That is where Seasons Park is located. And this is going to be one of the areas that's very impacted. The Policy Advisory Committee and MnDOT wanted to start making changes west of the 35W interchange, focused on Edina and Eden Prairie in these areas, even though the worst congestion, the worst traffic, and the most concentration of issues on the strip of highway is east of the interchange. It's also happens to be where we have the most renters, the most people of color living as well, including Seasons Park. So what the project was going to do was not look at the area east of the interchange to start. They were going to start west. Why? Because it was cheaper. That was why. We pushed and we advocated, and they said, okay, we're going to start east of the interchange and work on east of the interchange. And then part of this project, you see all these little lines here. These are the interchanges and the off and on ramps. And where Richfield and Bloomington is, they have many more interchanges, which is part of the congestion. They are two spaced together. So part of the project was to remove interchanges east of 35W, where Richfield and Seasons Park is. But they were going to remove the one closest to Seasons Park and the east side of Richfield, which we have a lot of renters, a lot of communities of color, blocking off access to the east part of our city. What we were able to do is secure funding for an arterial route called the underpass, like American Boulevard, that would open access to that part of the city and allow it to be used, for local traffic. But imagine the impact if we did not have an equity focus of closing off that, first of all, starting on the west side of the interchange. Second of all, closing the access points to community members that are working at the airport, working at the mall, low-income families, families of color, renters, completely cutting off access to that part of town. Not only were we able to fight for these changes, on the top left corner, you see this picture. It is a picture of a pedestrian bridge over Chicago Avenue, right where the Star is, where Seasons Park is located, connecting Richfield over to the other side of Bloomington, where Walmart and Sam's Club is located. That is the top grocery source for a lot of our families living in those apartment complexes. And right now they have to walk all the way over to Portland, walk across, and then walk back to Chicago to get to the grocery store. Now they have a direct access through this pedestrian bridge that we fought for to get direct access to the grocery store. And I'm sharing this example because these are things that we don't think about as public health professionals. This is public health work. This is once in a lifetime reconstruction of a highway system that we've been able to fight for, to change, to have more equitable outcomes. And who's going to be impacted? Our families in Seasons Park. And they were the ones advocating for this change. They're sitting on the committees with MnDOT. They're pushing for these changes in partnership with policymakers. So this is a smattering of examples of how we apply this framework in Richfield. And we have a long, long way to go with our work. But I want to open it up for questions, but I hope that my presentation has been able to help you think about your public health practice differently. And I would just leave with you, how can you strengthen your public health practice with these other concepts? Where is your growing edge? Where are you maybe afraid? Where are you uncomfortable? Maybe that's a signal that this is where you need to start. Have you been doing the work on yourself to understand where you're coming from? And then what is your role in this ecosystem of social change and movement building? For me, I love to be in big, mainstream, clunky organizations to be the inside organizer. Some people pull their hair out and that is not for them. They need to be in community. There's all different parts of the ecosystem. Where do you feel like your home is in the ecosystem? What are you doing to partner authentically with community? And what are the skills that you need to build and who do you need to ask? So those are the questions that I have for you all. And that's my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Wow, Maria, thank you so much. This was absolutely inspiring. I know that we have questions from the audience, but I want to get started with the first question, and then I know Ruby may have a question or two, and Dr. Bender as well. But when we had a conversation before this, in planning this session, one of the things you said to me just really clicked with me, and it was something about how you focus on helping convince community leaders, community organizers, and politicians, be it, county boards, et cetera, that they really are public health professionals. And I just wonder if, because it seems like that's part of this identity that you talked about in some of the frameworks, the early work that you talked about. I wonder if you would like to kind of add to that, because that seems like such an important component, rather than dropping the public health professional into this mix of, folks who are within the governance of the community. It's more about transforming how they see their role. So I just wanted to ask that question, if you want to address that here.
Yeah, I think the more we can do as public health professionals to see our identities in all the different areas. We could be in a state transportation organization. We could be anywhere and everywhere because of that concept of social determinants of health, and because of the concept that we need to make change at all different levels. And I think as public health professionals, we think of our role in our home as very narrow and where we could be located in the work that we can do. But I hope that this has shown like you can be all over the community, and we need public health professionals. I was at a meeting a couple years ago with mayors from across the nation. And I asked a question to a panel if they see themselves as public health professionals. And they said, no, they said, we're putting out fires and we're, responding to immediate needs and infrastructure. And it just broke my heart that our local elected officials don't understand the connection between community and health. And that's part of the issue on both sides. Within our discipline, we need to do more to connect the dots to all the different parts of our society that is public health, and outside of public health, we need to provide vehicles and education around how all these other things are public health.
Mayor, that was excellent. And I have never been as proud to be a Richfield resident as I am right now. So thank you. Let me use some terms that have been used by our audience and our colleagues. It was inspiring, excellent, and empowering. So thank you very much. As a recent graduate and a colleague of ours, to be frank, what do you think our training and education programs are missing that would better allow our students and us to be prepared for this work?
I am so glad you asked that, because I really struggled with like bringing that into the presentation because it's so important, but I was like, I need to focus. I will just tell you that I personally struggled, and because I am like a very annoyingly determined in my work, I was able in some ways, and because I have a lot of privilege, to overcome these barriers. But I already had a ton of school debt. I did not get into any of the programs that I applied for, even though I have great grades. I have horrible grades. I had horrible grades in kind of the STEM fields. And so the argument was made that, yes, you're good in all these areas, but in STEM you're not. And, we need to understand that you'll be able to do well in like epidemiology and some other classes. And so I had to pay out of pocket and take classes before, get better grades while I was working, while I was in office. And I didn't get into any programs, even though I had been doing public health for years. And then I was able to get into the executive program. So that was a huge removal of barriers, because I didn't have to submit my test scores. And I showed that I had the years of experience. But what happened is I had to pay everything out of pocket because I was a part-time student who needed to work full-time to pay my bills. And so I didn't get access to financial aid. Luckily, I was privileged enough to be working at an employer that would cover my tuition. So if I didn't have access to that, how the heck would I have paid for my school? It wouldn't have been possible. So this is an issue that I think the School of Public Health needs to address and help address. And basically what I did is just was in school for 5 years, only taking the amount of credits that my employer could cover and pay for. And then I had to take all this PTO and didn't, because I was taking classes. And so I really appreciated, I can't remember the summer program where you get credits in intensive courses. Those vehicles were very helpful. But I will say there's still a lot of financial barriers to entrance. I would say for, students of color and non-traditional students, the only reason I was able to overcome those barriers is because I had an employer that could help me. So that's the financial piece. You know, I remember being in classes where I was assigned to read a study about diabetes intervention in an African-American community in some urban city in the US. And, you know, my assignment was to understand the study design and the intervention. But how about talking about why we read so many articles on poor people of color with chronic disease, and we're not almost dehumanizing communities of color that we're reading about, and not talking about why our communities are experiencing these and the systemic barriers and inequities, or the mentality that we see ourselves as the professional who's going to tell the community what's necessary. This is not just in public health, it's in a lot of disciplines. Yes, we may be professionals and experts in some areas, but we need to build the skill set to understand how to work with community. And I feel like there was just very few classes, and there were some. I remember taking the community-based participatory research class and maybe another one, but I do think that this is part of why we have so many inequities in the state, is because we're not focusing on the how and the power sharing on all the things I talked about. So we have good intentions with very negative consequences for a lot of our communities.
Thank you so much for the feedback. Just a quick update. Across the school, we have removed the GRE requirement for applications and continue to look for ways to better address these concerns. So thank you so much for the impact. Jeff, before I hand it off to you, I'm just going to quickly read a question from our colleague, Lynn Blewett, who is on faculty. Again, she praises your presentation, and she's wondering if you could comment on how you view increasing gun violence as a from the public health perspective. Then just a quick note, us and EPI had a seminar on this 2 weeks ago, and we will put in the chat. Barb, if you could please put in the chat the site for the YouTube for everyone can find that recorded video. How do you view gun violence as a public health issue?
It is absolutely a public health issue. And to just be honest, this is an area where I have personally so much to learn and to grow in. And what I've seen in my own community of Richfield completely scares me and concerns me. And it's a very complex issue. And I think prevention is huge. I've seen organizations and groups in our community that have been so effective in working with our youth and working with our community, to build leadership, to build safe spaces for kids. And I've seen the impact that that has. You know, I don't have much to answer there, because this is something that I'm diving into personally so fast, and I feel like I need to learn so much more about it like yesterday. But I know that we have amazing leaders that I've been connecting with to understand where do we go from here, and what does it look like, and what are the community members leading in this space? You know, how do they see the solutions and the path forward? So right now, personally, I have so much learning to do. And we're starting a group in Richfield, and we'll be meeting next month, our first meeting, to talk about this very issue. And so I don't have the answer outside of, it is absolutely a public health issue. And it doesn't just affect that victim, it doesn't just affect the family, it reverberates across the entire community in so many different ways. And we're feeling that acutely in Richfield, and it's something I'm very concerned about. And I'd love to connect with people who work in that space to learn more.
Yeah, like mental health effects.
So Ruby, there's no other questions, so I have the liberty to ask a question. Maria, just a fantastic talk, and really encouraging in many respects. I actually, one of the things that really struck me was your passion about the childcare situation. And I was wondering, I just that's a great example of community engagement and empowerment of the Latino women. Could you just elaborate a little bit about really kind of the things that have grown from that? I guess I was so impressed that actually synergized, but to me, and then I looked at the pictures of the rooms that are full those are just mobilized individuals and women. Can you talk a little bit about how it is impact or other things that have spun off from that? I mean, to me, not only bringing those people together, but basically education and outreach and support. Can you just comment on how the kind of the impacts of that project?
For sure, and I'll be brief because I know we're ending here. But I will say, if you start with mobilizing and building your community, that's the vehicle for public health work. And so we started with the key issue that was identified by the community, which was school readiness in early childhood. But it has spun into them leading the work at Seasons Park. They were living in Seasons Park, organizing to help secure our housing stability. They've helped pass a lot of different ordinances. They helped with the Tobacco 21 work and helped lead that in Richfield and in Bloomington. They've been leaders in vaccinations and COVID response. So our families, our mothers, our babies, they're the foundation of our communities. And when we can support them with tools to mobilize for the health of their well-being, it just pays back in dividends. And they've done so much work, like I said, from Tobacco 21 to police reform, to affordable housing, to immigration reform, to COVID response. But it's these women that have stepped into their power and owned it and are teaching others to do the same.
Thank you for that. I'll turn it back to you, Ruby.
We're about out of time here, and I'd like to ask Dr. Tim Beebe, our interim dean, if he'd like to close us out.
Sure, we're at time, but I just first of all, I'm so sorry for the trauma and suffering that you've shouldered recently, and you're willing to share that and to still do this presentation today. So thank you for that. You had said at the outset that your talk was a little bit different. It was, but in a great way. And I'm so glad that multiple divisions participated in this, because your messages around how to actually execute public health in practice, how to use public health as a frame to bring about large scale and systemic change, and how to come up with actual solutions that are rooted in the community and focused on equity. I love the blind counteroffer example and your advocacy on the reconstruction of 35 and 494. So I just, it's amazing that I can't imagine there are many mayors that were motivated to run because they wanted to address social determinants of health and work within the institutions that really are in a position to change that. So thank you so much for taking the time today. It was a great presentation, and I'm glad that a very, very large, one of our largest audiences was able to hear this. So thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.